Hi, I'm Jake, 34, and last week my life turned into a complete nightmare in a way I never thought possible. I was at my parents' house, helping my 7-year-old son, Lucas, finish building a little backyard fort he'd been obsessed with for months, when my brother, Dan, decided to lend a hand. Now, Dan has always been the kind of guy who treats caution like a suggestion and chaos like a hobby, but I never imagined he'd actually cross the line into pure disaster. 1 second, Lucas was holding a plank, beaming like he'd just discovered a treasure, and the next, bam. Dan swung a steel rod like he was auditioning for a movie stunt, and it came crashing down right onto Lucas' leg. The sound, it wasn't just loud. It was this horrible, sickening crunch that made my stomach flip like I'd been launched off a roller coaster I didn't even want to ride. Lucas screamed. Oh, he screamed, and I ran over so fast I probably looked like a cartoon character with my arms flailing. His leg was bent in a way that no leg is supposed to bend, and blood was everywhere. And Dan just stood there frozen, eyes wide, jaw open, like he was watching a horror movie where he was both the villain and the bystander. But the worst part? My parents walked in right then. Instead of horror, instead of rushing to help, they gave him this weird, almost approving look. I swear, they actually said, well, he kind of deserved it. Deserved it. My 7-year-old son's leg. The kid who still needed help tying his shoes. Deserved it. I scooped up Lucas, called an ambulance, and tried not to panic while my parents muttered something about teaching lessons. And all I could think was, how did a sunny, ordinary Saturday turn into a nightmare? And why the hell was everyone else acting like it was just another Tuesday? By the time the ambulance arrived, Lucas was pale, shaking, and crying softly, and I felt my chest tighten like someone had thrown a cement block on it. Dan kept muttering apologies that sounded hollow even to him, and my parents, well, they hovered in the background like spectators at a sporting event, occasionally shaking their heads as if this was some inevitable lesson in life. I wanted to scream at them, but I had to focus on Lucas. At the hospital, it was chaos. Nurses were buzzing around, doctors asking questions, and Lucas kept squeezing my hand like he was trying to hold the world together in his tiny grip. I hadn't realized how heavy fear could feel until you see your child lying on a gurney, leg bent impossibly, with tears streaking down his face, and realize you have no idea how badly he's hurt. Dan followed me into the ER, but he didn't really know what to do. He tried to smile, maybe thinking humor would lighten the mood, and I almost punched him. I swear, the guy had that oops expression permanently etched on his face. I ended up grabbing his shoulder and shaking him just enough to get him to understand that this wasn't a drill, this wasn't funny, and this wasn't something we'd just laugh off over pizza later. Meanwhile, my parents kept hovering in the corner, whispering to each other. I caught snippets. He shouldn't have been playing so close. He needed to toughen up, and I felt my blood pressure spike so high I thought I'd collapse. Toughen up? My son couldn't even walk properly without help, and they were talking like this was some kind of karma lesson? I wanted to tear the hospital apart with my bare hands. The doctor came in finally, a calm, serious man with an air of no-nonsense authority, and confirmed my worst fears. Lucas' leg was broken in multiple places. Surgery was unavoidable, and recovery would be long and painful. Dan's face went pale, and my parents, well, they just nodded, like they were silently saying, see, he got what he needed. I felt like the world had flipped upside down, and everyone else was clapping for gravity. Sitting there with Lucas, holding his small hand, I realized I couldn't rely on my family the way I thought I could. And at that moment, I also realized something terrifying. Whatever happened next, I couldn't let Dan off the hook. Not this time. The next morning, right before Lucas was taken into surgery, everything inside me snapped. Not in some dramatic, table-flipping way, more like a quiet, deadly click in my brain, the kind you feel when you realize the people you grew up trusting are actually the ones blowing up your life. Lucas was lying there in that oversized hospital gown, trying so hard to be brave. He kept asking if he'd still be able to run when school started again. I kept telling him yes. I didn't know if it was true, but lying felt kinder than honesty. Dan shuffled in, wringing his hands, eyes darting around like he expected security to drag him out at any moment. Honestly, I almost wished they would. He tried to say something, some apology, some explanation, but before he got a full sentence out, my parents barged in behind him, acting like they were visiting a distant cousin with a minor cold. And that's when it happened, the moment everything in our family finally broke. My mom looked at Lucas and said, with this weird sigh, "Well, maybe next time he won't be so careless around tools." Around tools, my 7-year-old son, who was holding a plank, who trusted us. I don't even remember standing up, but suddenly I was on my feet, voice echoing in the room, telling them to get out. Not asking, ordering. My dad puffed up like he always does, trying to play the "I'm still the parent" card. But I wasn't a teenager anymore. I wasn't scared of him. I wasn't scared of any of them. I told them, point blank, that if they stayed another second, I'd call hospital security and have them escorted out. My mom's jaw dropped like she couldn't believe the audacity. Dan actually took a step back. My dad muttered something about family loyalty, and I snapped harder than I ever have in my life. Family loyalty ends when you defend the person who shattered my kid's leg, I said. You want loyalty? Try earning it. That shut them up. They left without another word, and for the first time in my entire life, the silence they left behind actually felt peaceful. But as the door closed, and I sat back down beside Lucas, watching the nurse wheel him toward the operating room, a darker realization hit me. This wasn't just an accident. This was a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And whatever came next, none of us were walking away the same. Sitting in the waiting room while Lucas was in surgery felt like living in slow motion. Every tick of the clock was a hammer pounding my nerves into dust. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my mind kept replaying the entire incident. Dan's reckless swing, the sickening crunch, the blood, my parents' faces. It was like watching a horror movie I couldn't pause or escape. Eventually, a nurse came out and told me the surgery went well, but that he'd need a cast and months of physical therapy. She mentioned something about swelling and pain management, and I nodded, but all I could hear was my own heart thumping. Months of watching my son struggle. Months of wondering if he'd ever run without hesitation. Months of replaying the moment over and over, wishing I could hit pause on life itself. Dan, of course, lingered outside the surgery doors. He tried to speak, muttering, I didn't mean to, and I nearly snapped. I wanted to shake him until he understood what he'd done. But instead, I gritted my teeth, held the line and said, "You don't get to be around right now. Not until my kid's safe and not until my family stops defending you." He looked crushed, and maybe that should have made me feel something. But all I felt was rage. Pure, concentrated rage, the kind that makes you consider very bad ideas in your head and then immediately think, don't act on them, Jake. I spent the rest of the day in the hospital room with Lucas. He kept dozing on and off, groaning whenever he moved. I tried to distract him with stories about school, the dog, even some ridiculous adventures I made up on the spot. He laughed sometimes, even if only for a second. That laughter was like fuel, like a little fire keeping me from burning down in despair. And yet, behind the temporary relief, the storm was gathering. Because when Lucas finally drifted off into a pain-medicated sleep, I realized I couldn't stop thinking about my family, about how they could sit there, judging, blaming, and somehow making my son suffering about him. My brother had swung the steel rod, yes, but my parents were the ones who made it feel like the fault was my kids. And that's when I knew something had to change. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right now. I barely slept that night in the hospital chair, the kind that feels like it was designed by someone who hated human spines. Every time Lucas shifted or whimpered, I jolted awake, half convinced something else had gone wrong. By morning, I was running entirely on coffee and parental adrenaline, nature's least stable cocktail. Around noon, a social worker knocked on the door. I thought she had the wrong room at first, but no, she was here for us. Apparently, when a child comes in with an injury involving a weapon-like object, the hospital has to file a report. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even considered the legal side of things yet. I'd been so wrapped up in the medical nightmare. She sat down with a clipboard and that calm, therapeutic voice that makes you feel like your entire life is being audited. She asked what happened. I told her. Well, I told her the truth, but then realized how horrifying it sounded when spoken out loud. When I got to the part where my parents said Lucas deserved it, her eyebrows shot up so fast they nearly left the building. I suddenly felt exposed, half angry, half ashamed that my own family could make me sound like I grew up in a cave with wolves. The social worker asked if I felt safe taking Lucas back into that environment. And that question hung in the air like a brick, because the answer was obvious. No, absolutely not. I wouldn't let my kid within 10 miles of that backyard again. Right as she was finishing up, my phone buzzed. My parents. Again. They'd already left 6 voicemails, each one more irritating than the last. Everything from, "You overreacted," to, "We're family. Stop being dramatic." One even had my dad saying, "Boys get hurt. That's life." I wanted to throw my phone into the hospital waste bin. On voicemail number 7, my mother's voice came through sounding strangely triumphant. "Your brother said he'll apologize properly. Now come home and stop this nonsense." Nonsense, right? My kid's leg was snapped like a twig, but apparently the real issue was my attitude. I turned off the phone and set it face down on the tray table so hard it rattled. And sitting there, watching Lucas sleep in that little hospital bed, leg elevated in a giant white cast, I felt something shift again. Something deeper, more final. This wasn't going to be just a fight. This was about to become a rupture. A before and after point in my life. And my family had no idea what was coming. The next day, Lucas was finally awake enough to talk longer than a few minutes at a time. He was groggy, still in pain, but alert, and that made everything hit even harder. He looked at me with those big, watery eyes and said, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" I swear that question physically knocked the air out of my lungs. I froze. My heart cracked like someone had stomped on it. I pulled a chair closer, took his hand gently, and said, "Buddy, you didn't do a single thing wrong. Not one. What happened was an accident, but it was not your fault." His little lip trembled, and he nodded like he wanted to believe me but wasn't sure he could. The idea that my parents' stupid, toxic, prehistoric logic had seeped into his head, that it had reached my kid, made my blood boil so hot I swear the room temperature rose. Later, when Lucas fell asleep again, a nurse came in and told me my family was waiting downstairs. Apparently they'd stopped by to clear the air. I didn't want to go, but part of me knew I needed to face them eventually. So I walked down to the lobby, preparing myself like I was about to step into a boxing ring. Sure enough, there they were. My mom with her arms crossed. My dad with that irritated dad face he'd perfected over the years. And Dan, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like a guilty teenager caught stealing candy. The second they saw me, my mom launched into it. "We didn't raise you to ignore your family." Great start. Then my dad chimed in with, "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're making us look bad." And then Dan, mumbled something that was meant to be an apology, but sounded more like he was reading off a script he didn't believe in. I didn't mean to hit him. It happened fast." I stared at the three of them, feeling this bizarre mixture of disbelief, anger, and a strange sadness creeping in. They weren't here to apologize. They were here to patch up the optics. They wanted the family image back, not the truth. So I told them something they absolutely did not expect. I said, "I talked to a social worker." My mom's mouth fell open. My dad's face went red instantly. And Dan blinked, confused, like I just announced I'd taken up skydiving. I explained slowly, deliberately, that what happened was serious, that Lucas needed safety, that their reaction was unacceptable, that I wasn't bringing him back into their house anytime soon. My dad stepped forward and pointed his finger at me, the classic move he used whenever he wanted to assert dominance. "You're destroying this family," he growled. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. I didn't swallow my feelings to keep the peace. I just looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, you destroyed it the moment you decided my son deserved to be hurt." The entire lobby went silent. They didn't expect that. Not from me. My mom looked stunned. Dan looked like he wanted to disappear. And my dad, He didn't have a comeback. I turned around and walked away without another word. Because in that moment, I realized something huge. This wasn't just a conflict. This was the beginning of me breaking away from a family that had been broken long before my son's leg ever was. Over the next few days, Lucas stayed in the hospital while I slept, or tried to sleep, in that awful chair, barely moving, barely eating, but always keeping an eye on him. Every time he shifted, every time he winced, my chest tightened like I was carrying a weight that wasn't mine alone. It was a mix of fear, anger, and that gut-twisting frustration of helplessness. I also started noticing something I hadn't before. The way Dan kept sneaking looks through the glass doors of the hospital. Not to check on Lucas properly, he was terrified to be around him, but to see if I was going to yell at him again. The poor guy looked like a guilty puppy, except this time there was no forgiveness coming. I began making plans. Legal steps, social services follow-ups, even conversations with the hospital staff about limiting contact. Not because I wanted to ruin Dan's life, but because I wanted to protect my son. The more I thought about letting them back into our lives too soon, the more I realized how fragile Lucas' trust was now. One wrong word, one misplaced excuse, and I'd lose him for good. Meanwhile, my parents tried everything. Calls, texts, passive-aggressive voicemails, even sending flowers to the hospital room. I ignored all of it. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want them trying to manipulate my emotions. I wanted boundaries. Then, late one night, Lucas woke up crying in pain. I lifted him into my lap, cradled him, and whispered stories about stupid adventures his dad had gotten into as a kid, stories so ridiculous that even in pain, he managed a weak little giggle. And in that moment, I realized something. My family might be broken, toxic even, but Lucas' world didn't have to be. I could rebuild that world myself. I made a promise to him then, soft but unshakable. No one would ever make him feel like he deserved harm. No one. And as I sat there, holding him while the night crept on, I knew that the fight wasn't just with Dan or my parents anymore. It was with the idea that family meant loyalty at any cost. Because sometimes, family needed to be held accountable. Sometimes love meant standing up and saying, "Not this time, not ever." By the time dawn broke, I felt a strange, dangerous kind of clarity. The storm wasn't over. There were battles to fight, conversations to have, and probably a few heads to explode along the way. But for the first time, I felt ready. Ready to protect my son. Ready to face my family. And ready to finally stop pretending everything would just go back to the way it was. Lucas finally came home from the hospital a week later, walking on crutches with a massive white cast covering half his leg. He was quieter than usual, a little more cautious, like the world had suddenly become a place he wasn't sure he could trust. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. Every glance at that cast reminded both of us that everything had changed in a split second. I spent the first few nights sleeping in his room, just to make sure he didn't roll over in his sleep and wake up panicked. I made ridiculous safe zones in the house. No heavy objects, no sharp corners, and definitely no backyard experiments for at least 6 months. He laughed sometimes at my over-the-top precautions, but I could tell he liked that I was making him feel secure again. And then the calls started. My parents, Dan, random family members, even some old friends who had no business knowing anything, they all wanted updates. Some texts were polite, some passive-aggressive, some outright blaming me. "Maybe you shouldn't have let him play outside," one of them wrote. "Accidents happen," another said, and every single message felt like a punch in the gut. I didn't answer any of them, not one. Instead, I focused on Lucas, teaching him silly tricks to get around on crutches, reading him comics, letting him plan small adventures inside the house. For the first time since the accident, I felt like I was reclaiming our little world. I even started documenting everything. Photos of his progress, notes on therapy exercises, little reminders of milestones, so that if anyone tried to undermine or question the reality of what had happened, I would have proof. But even as I built this bubble of safety around us, I couldn't shake a feeling that this was far from over. Dan hadn't apologized sincerely. My parents hadn't understood the gravity of what they'd condoned. And deep down, I knew that they expected me to eventually forgive and forget. I clenched my fists at the thought. No, not this time. Not ever. I knew that soon, I would have to confront them. Not just to protect Lucas, but to make it absolutely clear that this family dynamic, this twisted excuse for loyalty, was over. That whatever remained of our family wasn't going to dictate the terms of my son's safety. And as I tucked Lucas into bed that night, watching him drift off with a small, hopeful smile, I realized something. The real fight wasn't just about the accident. It was about redefining every boundary, every expectation, and every lie my family had ever told me about what loyalty and love should look like. Because the truth was simple. No one, not even family, gets to hurt my kid, and if they think they do, they're about to find out exactly what that means. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming in my head. No more waiting, no more tiptoeing around their egos. If my parents or Dan wanted to claim family loyalty, they were going to have to earn it, and right now they hadn't earned a damn thing. I called a lawyer I'd been putting off for years. Not because I wanted to ruin my brother's life, though honestly I wasn't ruling that out, but because I needed protection for Lucas. I explained everything. The accident, my parents' enabling, Dan's recklessness, and how I feared for my son's safety if he went near them. The lawyer listened without flinching, asking detailed questions, taking notes like he was preparing for battle. And for the first time in days, I felt a little of the weight lift. Someone outside the mess actually believed me. Then came the harder part, confronting Dan. He came over that afternoon, acting nervous, shuffling like a guilty kid. I didn't let him sit. I stood, crossed my arms, and just stared at him. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He had no idea where to start. Dan, I said finally, you broke my son's leg. Not a little scratch. Not an accident we can shrug off. You broke his leg. And my parents, I stopped myself. I didn't want to devolve into yelling at them in front of him. They defended you. He flinched, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the first time he'd actually understood the gravity of what he'd done. I didn't mean to, he muttered. Weak, ineffective. I shook my head. Meaning doesn't matter. What matters is what you did. And if you want to be in Lucas' life again, you're going to have to earn it. Slowly, carefully, on our terms. He swallowed hard. I could see him calculating, realizing this wasn't a negotiation he could win. Over the next hour, I laid down the rules. No unsupervised visits. No excuses. No defensiveness. Apologies don't erase broken bones, and they certainly don't erase broken trust. Dan nodded, more than a little defeated, and I left him there to sit with that weight. Later that evening, as I tucked Lucas into bed, I realized I was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. But there was a new feeling mixed in with the fatigue. Resolve. Because I finally understood something clearly. This family couldn't define us anymore. I could protect my son, rebuild his world, and even if it meant cutting them out entirely, I was willing to do it. And deep down, I also knew that the storm wasn't over. But for the first time, I wasn't just surviving it. I was preparing to fight back. Life at home settled into a tense routine. Lucas navigated the house on crutches, therapy sessions and pain meds dictating our days. Every little misstep made me hyper-aware, ready to protect him at all costs. My parents bombarded me with texts, some polite, some blaming, some guilt-tripping, but I ignored them. Silence became my shield. Then Dan showed up unannounced. Lucas asked if he could come in, and I set clear boundaries. Supervised, short visit, and only with me present. He followed the rules, and Lucas even managed a small laugh. That night, watching Lucas sleep, I realized the accident had broken the old family dynamic, but it had also made us stronger. I wasn't just surviving anymore, we were taking control of our story. That night, I tucked Lucas into bed and whispered, "You're safe now." He smiled sleepily, and for the first time in weeks, I felt relief. Dan was finally taking responsibility, my parents stayed away, and I knew the real victory wasn't erasing the past. It was protecting my son and reclaiming our lives. Life wasn't perfect, but Lucas was safe and I could finally breathe.